Wednesday night to you, and thank you very much for joining us. I am Thabo Mdluli. Cultural racism is what we're talking tonight. It refers to prejudices and discrimination based on cultural differences between ethnic or racial groups. This includes the idea that some cultures are superior to others. That is what we are talking about tonight. The prevalence and the impact of tribalism, cultural racism, ethnicity, and racial classification in South Africa, and what it will take to uproot these phenomena. Joining me to talk about this is the Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, Angelo Fick, Senior Research Associate and Adjunct Professor at the School of Public Law at the University of Cape Town, Nomboniso Gasa, AfriForum Head of Research, Barend Uys, and Associate Professor at the Wits University School of Governance, Professor William Gumede. You can be a part of this conversation tonight. Tag us on Twitter at Newsroom405, or you can WhatsApp your questions and your comments to 072-110-5584. Good evening to you all, and thank you very much for being with us tonight on the Newsfeed Late Night. I hope you can hear me at this particular time. We could be having some challenges. Professor Gumede, Angelo, Nomboniso, and Barend, good evening. All right, we seem to be having some difficulty there with establishing that connection. Well, the question that we are asking you tonight, do you think or do you see it still continuing to happen today in modern day South Africa, the idea of particular ethnic groups being left out of development purely because of their cultural difference to another, or a particular group being held superior to another? Let's try and bring in our panel now to this conversation. Good evening to you all. I hope you can hear me. All right, it's not happening. We're having serious challenges, it seems, tonight with establishing that connection. Let's have a look at what's making news then. In the meantime, the Supreme Court of Appeal has declared the ANC's 2018 Free State Elective Conference unlawful. This comes after party members Matshepo Ramakatsa, Themba Mvandaba, and Shashapa Mutaung took the matter to court this year, citing pre-audit irregularities. Now, the May 2018 conference saw Sem Mashidini voted in as the Free State State Chairperson, replacing now ANC Secretary General Ace Magashule. This is the third time that the Free State Provincial Executive Committee has been nullified through courts since 2012. The party will have to elect a new PEC. Meanwhile, ANC Free State Steering Committee member Polediso Motsoeneng says it's now the norm for political matters in the Free State to be resolved through the courts.
It's not for the first time that the ANC Provincial Executive Committee of the Free State is nullified through the courts. You will remember that in 2012, the Constitutional Court in the Ramakatsa versus the PEC took a decision to nullify the Provincial Executive Committee then on the basis of the same reasons that today's judgment has adjudicated for. Similarly, in 2017, the same court decided to adjudicate on the very same matters that were brought to its attention by the ANC branches, who felt that the ANC internal democratic processes were fraudulently undertaken and were rigged. And this is now what is normal in the politics of the Free State. So it is for the third time that the courts adjudicated on the dispute that has been brought to its attention by the members of the ANC. It's unfortunate that these matters are political, but ultimately they find expression in as far as the legal disputes. In fact, the legal matters would have not been undertaken by even the membership, which were looking up to the leadership to intervene in a political dispute.
All right, let's get back then to our panel conversation tonight. Angelo Fick, Nomboniso Gasa, Barend Uys, and Professor William Gumede joining us for that chat. Hope you can hear me this time around. Good evening.
Good evening.
Angelo,
good evening.
I'll begin with you, and we're going to track in a moment the origin and the history of tribalism in South Africa. But I just want to firstly start by talking to what is currently happening right now. I mean, just a couple of days ago, we saw a cultural activist, so to speak, being kicked out of a mall. And he, of course, then goes on to say this is something that has been ongoing. That incident is a beginning of many others that have happened before, where he feels that the Ndebele culture, for example, is being left out of development, be it on media spaces, be it in the politics, or even in social settings, and taking it upon himself to be a cultural activist for that particular ethnic category. So activism defined by ethnic categories. Is there space for that in a democratic dispensation that we're talking of in South Africa? Angela?
Well, I don't know whether I'm necessarily the best person to talk about whether there is or should be space, but it certainly is a feature of post-millennial South Africa that people increasingly, over the distance that we've traveled from 1994, have looked to the ethnic categories or the tribal categories or the racial categories established earlier in South Africa's history as the basis for arguing that government has somehow not delivered services, not to themselves defined as active communities living in very mixed spaces, but as people belonging to particular groups that are defined in ethnic or tribal terms. And part of this is possibly also because so much of the spatial patterns and some of the ideas and ways of being and thinking of the past haven't really been undone over the last 27 years. And in fact, in some senses, they've returned with a greater vengeance.
And Prof Gumede, let's get your views on politics of ethnical or politics that are ethnically centered. It's even a tongue twister for me to put together. But politics along tribal lines, we have seen that in South Africa. But does that then mean there needs to be a space that is created for activists who are that way inclined?
Thank you. The very first thing is, we're a very diverse society, and often in a post-colonial societies is very diverse. If we don't govern inclusively all of the time, that's where we get, tribalism re-emerge or get strengthened, because, it start off in a sort of pre-colonial, pre-apartheid, the apartheid government and the former colonial government encouraged tribalism, and supposedly the project in 1994, democracy was supposed to build an inclusive society. Now, one of the reasons why tribalism presently has increased, and I think the first thing is state failure, because the state has failed. And because the state has failed, and the state's inability to hold together, the diverse communities of South Africa, and the state's failure to deliver to people equitably, and then it means that some people who feel left out, and they feel left out, then they start looking at as a tribal issue instead of just they've been left out because the state have failed everyone in the country. And the second thing is, of course, is corruption that we have, and again, it undermines the credibility of the state, and again brings to state failure, and again, it leads to the issues of tribalism. And then I think also what the ANC as a governing party has not governed inclusively. I mean, in this diverse society, it hasn't harnessed the talents of all communities, whether you're black or white or whatever language you speak in the country. That hasn't happened. And the ANC traditionally as a party, non-racialism, unfortunately, it hasn't, in our times, racialism has not been a focus. And you remember just about, a couple of years ago, it was Jacob Zuma when he was president of the ANC in the country. He had this in his campaign, 100% Zulu, and so on. I mean, that clearly is tribalism. I mean, at the time I really also raised my voice with this sort of thing, because once you open up these sort of tribal politics, it's very difficult to return back, to the, kind of diverse politics. And maybe lastly is that traditional leaders, I'm afraid to say, traditional leaders is also often, because the state is failing, what they've done is, they've also built their own constituencies, I think, around now ethnic communities to build, their own patronage and so on. So that is also, has done that. Yeah. So often then, when states fail, people do seek answers, in tribe, in local communities because, for protection, for solidarity, because the state has been unable to offer that.
Barend, there's lots that's been said as far as interpretation around what ethnicity does. Some say it's destructive to national unity. Others say it blocks economic growth. Others say, well, it is welcome to those who are allies of continued white dominance. Others are just intrigued by it by its continuation in society. Do you think we probe enough this concept of tribalism or ethnicity, or do we merely just disapprove from a distance?
The big debate that we need to do, we haven't done it. It hasn't been done in intellectual spaces, hasn't been done in civil society, neither has it been done in the ANC or in opposition parties, is to say, what do we want the South Africa to be? Do we want to spend our time in the old, colonial and apartheid definitions of communities? Is that where we want? Is that the space where we want to be, or do we have to reimagine a new future, new language, new definitions, new descriptions? So there has been an absolute failure, and I include myself in it, of rethinking, the definitions of colonialism and the definitions of apartheid, and to force this new common South Africanness of the future in a democracy. So yes, we've been very superficial around the debates. In fact, the debate has been non-existent. It's been either populist or superficial or shallow, or we've returned to the old ways. The pre-1994, the apartheid ways, or the colonial periods of descriptions. We have not moved forward, and we have not reimagined and retaught what is a common identity in our times and in the future of our children.
All right, Prof, deciding to take that one. Barend, I'll come back to you. I'll also get your views on it in a moment. Let's take a break. We'll continue in a moment at Newsroom 405. You can tag us on Twitter, or you can give us a shout on the WhatsApp line with your comments tonight, 072-110-5584. Broadly speaking, ethnicity, more than the race question, which we will touch on in a moment as well, but also among the various ethnic groups, the various human tribes, there has been a growing sound of certain tribes being left out of the development. What is your feeling and your take on that? The Newsfeed Late Night continues next. With us here on the Newsfeed Late Night, Angelo Fick, Nomboniso Gasa, Barend Uys, as well as Professor William Gumede with us in conversation. You can be a part of it by tweeting us at Newsroom 405 or WhatsApp your comments tonight on 072-110-5584. Barend, I'll give you an opportunity also to take a bite at that. Do we probe enough this question of the nature of ethnicity and how that impacts on the normal functioning of society? Or do we simply just disapprove from a distance?
So I will start with a quote from Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, where he said, "The Zulu nation precedes democracy, apartheid, the ANC, and even the Union of South Africa. Our kings have reigned for more than 200 years. And why I'm saying this is because I definitely agree that we do not engage this enough. And it's because we are scared of reality. And if we face the simple South African reality or the Southern African reality, is that we've got many different cultural communities. And this is something we need to recognize, and this is something we need to talk about. But what I disagree, I see with some of the panelists, is that you do not have to give up your own cultural identity to live in peace, to have peaceful coexistence. So at AfriForum, our view and our approach is you need to have mutual recognition and respect. So you need to mutually recognize each other, that we belong here, that we've got a role to play. And then, of course, we respect each other. And of course, that respect and trust is built when you cooperate. But to say that, and I mean, this is what I'm picking up, for the nation to thrive, the tribe must die. If we go back to the French Revolution, and there might have been some good consequences from the French Revolution, but the French Revolution definitely was a massive rob of the cultural richness that was what once was, what was occurring and what was existing in France. So I'm extremely thankful in South Africa that we still have this really rich cultural diversity. I think our biggest challenge is actually to move beyond race, because in my mind that is our big challenge, because we're still sort of stuck in a let's call it in a black and white situation, or a black colored and Indian, that kind of situation. And you know, I always tell people, you know, I've never met somebody, and when I ask them, who are you, or to what group do you belong, or what's your culture, I've never received the answer that I am white or I am black. I'm more likely to receive the answer like, I'm from Barulumbo Rakulana. That I do here. And that is something that we need to discuss. And in my mind, it's about protecting this heritage. You know, we are not just living out of the blue and then we're gone again. You know, we received something from our ancestors, and we, this current generation, we've got a responsibility to again pass it on to our children. And one of these very rich and wonderful things that we do receive is our own culture and our own cultural identity. And luckily in South Africa, we still have a lot of that, unlike in some other countries where they simply banished all this cultural richness.
Yeah. Nomboniso, I mean, I'm not a historian, and neither am I an anthropologist, but I've heard it being said that Africans used to organize themselves in tribes without the narrow ethnic loyalties that we are seeing today. So my question then is, what provides the material base for ethnic class consciousness that we're seeing today, and that eventually transcends into cultural differences?
That's a huge question. There's a lot of interference going on. That's a very big question, but let me start by saying it's important for us to situate the conversation on tribalism today, cultural identities and heritage within the historical framework of South Africa. Even us, as we sit here, I don't know how old Mr. Barend is, but my two other colleagues, I think we kind of post 40. Well, I'm certainly post 50. I'm post middle age, and therefore, politics of identity, reconstruction, or rather, construction of identity has a very specific resonance for us. I'm a child of the 60s, in terms of when I was born, late 60s. And really, I came of age in the 1980s in the politics in South Africa. I grew up in a community that was homogeneous, that was Xhosa speaking, and everything was Xhosa. It was only in 1987, when I went to the University of the Western Cape, that I actually encountered on a daily basis and got into communication and in commune with Pedi-speaking people, with Tswana-speaking people, with people who were not Xhosa-speaking, and even Zulu-speaking people, for that matter. So it's important for us to locate where we come from and how it informs a number of positions that we take. Having grown in that time and having come of age in that political movement, there were also other things that we learned about identity. For example, even today, well, first, I'm not Xhosa, so I take very serious objection when people say the Xhosa woman, because I'm not, but I am Xhosa speaking. And so Mr. Barend says, people say they reference their groups, the linguistic groups and cultural groups. They don't say they're black or white. Well, being black is obvious. It's very obvious. So I don't have to state that. Or being white is obvious in the South African context. But these identities are incredibly complicated. When we reference Samora Machel's quote, "For the nation to survive, the tribe must die," it's important that we understand that came out of a political process where tribal identities, ethnic identities, were manipulated. So us Africans, people of my shade, were not considered to be Africans under apartheid. We were considered to be tribes, right? And that is why you had all these homelands that existed. And so we're neither South African nor African, but we're made of small groups of people. So resistance comes from that. But what is important is that obviously consciousness has become much more nuanced and much more aware of a whole range of things. So people, not even Samora Machel, in fact, started to review his position. So we are no longer saying the tribe must die. We understand that I don't have to give up the fact that I grew up in the Eastern Cape, the fact that I'm Xhosa speaking, the fact that and so many other identities in order to embrace the identity of being Africans. So this is where the challenge is. And I want to put this firstly at the door of the state. I think when transition happened in South Africa, the government that ascended was tasked with a very, very important historical purpose, which was to undo colonialism and to undo, not as government, but to lead a process of reimagining and undoing all the negative aspects that came with that colonial and apartheid context. And they have not done very well in terms of that. Also, politicians, whenever it suits them, obviously they also use these identities, So it's not just JZ saying he's 100% Zulu, but even at on the eve of the 1994 transition, when ANC had to consider what that transition would mean, especially in the face of resistance from KZN. Given the complexities at that time, there were a lot of things that I think we need to have conversations about. So, for example, you had people like Jeff Radebe, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, and many others going to KZN wearing the Zulu regalia and being seen as embracing that, because understandably so, they understood that the constituency that they had to appeal to in terms of the vote, took that identity seriously. And it's not just KZN. It's the same thing also in the Eastern Cape and other provinces.
Yeah.
So there is this thing of instrumentalizing where the state, where even, business, capital, and even all of us sitting here, there is this thing of instrumentalizing identity. We are guilty of that.
Yeah.
So nobody is saying people should, Mr. Barend, nobody says people should give up their ethnic identities. No, we embrace that, and we need to figure out how to really live and give expression.
Let's just move it a bit then. Angelo, let's get in on that idea of anti-colonial resistance, the rejection of the colonists' misdefinition and misinterpretation of these differences among the various tribes, and how that was used for those who wanted to align it with the extension of white dominance.
So I think it's important to pick up on something that Ms. Gasa indicated, which is that, and also Professor Gumede had outlined, that the history of the struggle against colonial rule, and then later on the extension of that colonial rule and its intensification under apartheid, for many black South Africans required a talking across and over the boundaries constructed for them. Now, Mr. Ace starts off by quoting Mangosuthu Buthelezi, and while that quote is interesting in its own, what it does is it slides over the many other the many other actual political ways of relating that black South Africans had in the subcontinent without white interference prior to colonialism. It wasn't just that there was a Zulu kingdom 200 years ago. There were many Zulu-speaking peoples who weren't part of that kingdom necessarily. There was a far more complex Nguni polity and set of polities that interacted with one another in very complex ways. And so when we start thinking of anti-colonial resistance, which is partly what the founding of the South African Native National Congress was about, the precursor of the ANC, was to start thinking about those people who were excluded by the colonial policy from citizenship and human rights. And you can go all the way back through to Plaatje and to Kluma and actually see there the kinds of reasonings behind not abolishing tribal difference or language differences, but to have to work over them precisely because what was being done was the divide and rule conquest system of the colonial regime. Z.K. Matthews outlines this by talking precisely in the ways that Ms. Gasa spoke about it, of meeting other people who spoke different languages and having to learn those languages at Fort Hare, and in learning those languages, learning a whole set of other worldviews. Now, if one lives in urban spaces in Gauteng, many black South Africans are masters or mistresses, if you want a non-gender term, of multiple tongues. And this easy division into ethnic groups a la apartheid or colonialism is no longer really possible and hasn't been for a very long time. So the veelvolkigheid of a verwoerd, to use J.M. Coetzee's critique of the 1990s construction of South African identity, of culture as costume and performance. We need to move beyond that and begin to see culture as dynamic. And I think that's partly where Mr. Uys is also coming in, where he, ironically, what he suggests is a more dynamic view and vision and definition of people's being, that it isn't just that they belong to no category or that they only belong to a category. But we must also remember that these kinds of political categories, or, if we are going to ask people to think of themselves in those categories, have political consequences. To go through somebody like Mahmoud Mamdani, who echoes A.B. Kluma when he says, if people are going to be defined in tribes by the state, and they are subject to, and Ms. Gaza can speak more, expertly on this, and are going to be defined as subjects to those tribal authorities, they lose out on certain kinds of citizenship rights because they are not only citizens in the way that some of us who are not defined tribally can be. And so much of their life is spent negotiating complicated authority issues and a state defining them as such. And so this is not just about whether people feel good about speaking a language or whether they identify in the category. If the state starts administering this as many people want it to, what you will end up with is people defined in categories and being told they can go to certain universities, they can only, have certain access to land, they can only have certain access to kinds of citizenship rights of varieties. And beyond that, I think we owe it to our children to give them a far more complex understanding that isn't just steeped in the old and, quite frankly, scientifically untenable categories of colonialism and apartheid. It is one of the great disservices of post-apartheid education that it did not allow people or encourage people to unlearn what is, quite frankly, all of the rubbish they learned under Christian nationalist education, under Bantu education, and under, very, very suspect systems of education that continue to define culture as static, identity as unitary, and somehow not open to negotiation and change.
Angelo Fick, Nomboniso Gasa, Barend Uys, and Professor William Gumede with me tonight. They are staying on, and we'll get back to them and interrogate the ethnic stereotypes which produce the kind of situation that we are seeing today. Things like positive views about one's history or heroes of one's ethnic past and the manifestation of one's culture, especially when we're talking language here in South Africa. You can tweet us at Newsroom405, WhatsApp your questions and your comments to 072-110-5584. We're back in a minute. Welcome back with us here on the newsfeed late night. Angelo Fick, Nomboniso Gasa, Barend Uys, and Professor William Gumede in conversation with us, and something that is really complicated to navigate because it has so many facets to it that we are discussing tonight. And I'm interested to get to what your thinking is around this topic of cultural racism, so to speak, or ethnicity or tribalism. Newsroom Africa 405, that is the tag on Twitter. WhatsApp your questions and your comments to 072-110-5584. Professor Gumede, let's then track a little bit some of the things that many people say contribute towards ethnic identities and ideologies. And these are the things that we hold dear. Things like heroes of one's ethnic past, the manifestation of one's culture, especially through language. And that's a big thing in South Africa, the preservation of certain languages and people feeling, well, there's an erasure of certain cultures when, for example, an institution has a policy that says we will use this as the standard language of instruction. Positive views about one's history. How do we incorporate that without necessarily creating the kind of differences that we are seeing around cultures?
Yes, maybe just opening statement just to say that, we will have to transform our self-identity away from the, very narrow, whether it's white, black, African colors or Indian, to much more inclusive identity. That's really, sort of opening statements. And that's being born in a particular community should just be one aspect of that identity. There are many other aspects, and I think that really is the thing that has been underemphasized, which is going forward, is we really have to emphasize that, it is the community that you're born in is one aspect of your identity, and then there's a whole lot of other, identities, and that really is what it means to be South African and what it means to be African. Not a narrow identity, because I'm Zulu speaking now, that is my only identity. There's one aspect of this.
So, are you saying I then need to abandon that significance of saying, well, I love my language and its intricacies and what it means, because in language it also expresses who I am, it expresses the space that I occupy, but it gives me more than just the fact that it is a language to communicate. Do I abandon that in the name of a new cultural or new identity in a new dispensation?
No, absolutely not. I'm not making an argument for abandoning. What I'm saying is that it's just one of your aspects of your, of your identity. One aspect. There's such a richness in this country, and that richness is your full identity, and that's the difference. Being South African is that there's multiple identities. So what I'm saying is every individual in South Africa have multiple identities. And it would be perhaps, it would be the language that you speak and the community that you grow up, that's one of your identities, and perhaps maybe it could be your dominant identity, but there are other parts of you, that's not your only you, and that is the way that we have to look at it. I mean, I just wanted to also if you allow me just to respond, perhaps, to Barend, just, my generation in the 1980s, it was the Zulu community was essentially divided, in fact, not even in the 1980s, for a century, between two visions of, Zuluness. One either much more inclusive within the broader South Africanness versus the one that's much more narrow. And, so for my generation, the 1980s was really for the youth. If you were then aligned to the ANC, UDF, or to the unions, the idea of a much more inclusive Zuluness, although we didn't know exactly what it would mean, but it was instinctively to feel, it has to go beyond the very, very narrow confines. And I mean, and that was in a sense what Mandela in 1990 calls the fight between brother and brother, in a Zulu speaking community, because between the IFP and the ANC, that was at the heart of it. And that was not even the only time that battle was there. It was even, immediately after the First World War, between the First World War and the Second World War, there was even two ANCs in KwaZulu-Natal at the time, over this same issue. And the issue never died down. And it was the generations of the 1980s again had to battle it. And that is why, with the death of King Goodwill Zwelithini, why it has also been quite a divisive, essentially two views really of his role during the period. The arguments from many of my generation that he could have played a much more inclusive role in the 1980s, and rather than, being a patron of the IFP and essentially, being seen to embrace one way of being Zulu and so on. I mean, I just wanted to, just a response to you. But I mean, going forward, in how do we build this sort of, these broader identities? Is absolutely going to be crucial that we do it, because if we don't do it, really, it is going to be one of the fault lines of our society, and potentially, instability if you don't deal with it. If you look at many of the, many African countries, many of them are very diverse, and many have been unable to deal with this issue, to move beyond narrow definitions of identity and embrace multiple identities, where your own, your language that you speak, and the communities you come from is part of this identity, and that we encourage others, to learn new languages, to learn, about, the other the other identities, within the broader South Africa.
All right.
That is really how we build this.
Barend, let's bring you in here then. Inclusive South Africa would look beyond just one aspect of the community in which you live in. So things like your own identity, which you find, for example, in language, in the heroes that you want to worship, or especially also in your views about your own history. What do you say to that?
I think I'm going to start with this, and I'm going to say, is this reimagine or is this rediscover? Now, of course, if you're thinking along the lines of, let's call it liberalism or liberal individualism, and you're thinking classical conservative, of course, you're going to not end up at the same place, and your departure point is also not going to be the same place. So, of course, my departure point is, yes, you can say reimagine, but in my mind, one of the things that we really need to do is to rediscover, okay? If we do not really rediscover, if we say we are not willing to rediscover, in other words, we are not willing to really look back at the past, and most definitely you can also look further back than apartheid, and you can look further back than colonialism.
Unpack rediscover for us, Barend.
Say again?
Unpack rediscover. What do you mean by rediscover?
Okay. Let me give you a simple example, and let's speak about peaceful coexistence. So of course, what is my view on peaceful coexistence? If you respect me for who I am, then I can respect you for who you are. Okay? That is my departure point. And one critical thing is there. It is not for me or for my cultural community to prescribe or to decide for any other cultural community. And I would, of course, expect the same in return. So if I look back in the past, one thing that I can find is, for instance, a history of good relationships. And maybe one can speak about one example. I can name the story of King Dinuzulu when he became king of the Zulus. How did that happen? It was actually because there was a good relationship between the king's grandfather and the voortrekkers, and they remembered that. And if you go back just at the time when the Great Trek started, the good relationship that existed between the Barolongo Seleka and the Afrikaners. So that is something that is forgotten. And again, to me, it's also about normalizing history, and by choosing words correctly, I always struggle to understand why, when we speak in Africa, why do we use the word tribe? Because, why do we not speak about a Bavarian tribe and a Saxon tribe and a Prussian tribe? When we now, speak about Germany as an example. You do not do it like that. You've got Bavarians and Saxons. Now, of course, the point is here, why do we use different words as Africans in Africa? And in my mind, that is part of also trying to normalize our past and to recognize realities. We are very comfortable with the idea of multiple identities. And I mean, to me, it's easy. Of course, one of my identities is I am an Afrikaner. Another identity is, of course, I'm a South African because I'm a citizen of South Africa. I'm also a Christian, okay? But I'm also a traditionalist. So we are very comfortable with the idea of multiple identities. And I really want to agree with Mr. Fick. I think the most dangerous situation is where you have the state forcing some things or deciding for people, or one community deciding for another. So the only people that can decide, in my mind, for a specific community is the community itself.
All right.
And one practical way of achieving this is actually building community institutions. And a community is a product of culture, and culture is a product of community. And one of the practical manifestations of culture is the unique community institutions of this culture. And this is something that AfriForum wants to protect. We've got different kinds of cultural institutions. One such an institution is the institution of traditional leadership. If that is an institution that is important to a specific community, We do not have that kind of institution in the Afrikaner people, but we believe community institutions need to be protected, and there must be space for them to exist.
I'll get Nomboniso to actually respond exactly to that. For example, the institutions that Barend is talking about. When we come back from the break, Angelo Fick, Nomboniso Gasa, Barend Uys, and Professor William Gumede will take your views as well and your thoughts on Twitter and on WhatsApp tonight. Stay with us. You're live on the news feed, Lena. Thanks for staying on, and we continue with our panel conversation tonight on human tribes, its origins, history, and its impact in society. Angelo Fick, Nomboniso Gasa, Barend Uys, and Professor William Gumede are part of this conversation. We'll look at some of your WhatsApp messages also coming in tonight. But Nomboniso, I wanted you to immediately address that question of it would be useful, instead of the state dictating to people or particular cultures what to do, but to develop institutions. Institutions here, we're talking about, for example, an institution of traditional leaders, and let them be the deciders of what that community will do.
Well, first and foremost, I think it's very important to remind my colleague that on the eve of negotiations in South Africa, before the talks about talks, it was a very, very important conversation on the place of ethnic minorities in South Africa, as it was called. And this came particularly from white ethnic minorities, if you like, who were afraid that all of a sudden they were going to be, who wanted to be clear about what this cultural pluralism means. So the issues that we're raising here, I think it's important to actually reference our history and look at how we have dealt with them before. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights that we have in the Constitution, which protects cultural identities, language, belief systems, people's cultures and customs, but make it subject to the equality, that everybody is equal. I think it's important that we actually re-emphasize that some of these issues, the Constitution tries to grapple with them. Secondly, there is more to Africans and to African identity and cultures than the institution of traditional leadership. And it's important that, this shortcut that tends to develop with politicians, that if you want to talk to Africans and if you want to appeal to them, use traditional leaders, it's actually very problematic. Thirdly, I think it's important that we understand identity as more than performative, as more than the spectacle, as more than the drama. And I like beads, I like all those kinds of things. I like the drama that goes with it, But it's more than that, and it's lived and practiced every day by people in their own everyday lives. So this idea that people are being told to abandon who they are, you do not abandon identity, you do not abandon culture. It's not a package. It's not this thing that you put it there and then you put another head. It goes with you at all times. I think it's also important to acknowledge the fact that at certain points, different aspects of our identities are emphasized. Okay? So at certain points, I feel more like a Xhosa speaking person, okay, in terms of language, in terms of all those kinds of, at a particular, in a particular context. In other times, I feel more like a Black woman, and a Black feminist. In other times, I feel more like a cosmopolitan South Africa. So, and all these things, they are with us at all times. So different situations and contexts bring out different aspects of who you are. So people negotiate. People that live in my community, that community that I said was cultural homogeneous. It was cultural homogeneous linguistically and in terms of the traditions and all of that. But there were other identities that were uniting and also dividing that community. I come from a strongly Anglican family, for example. The development of African independent churches and all these kinds of things also bring about a whole range of other nuances on who we are. Yeah. Mr. Barend says he's Afrikaner. Yes, but I can assure you that the way in which you feel that you are Afrikaner is different from how Brown Fisher felt that he was Afrikaner. And he said this, and he said, when he was being challenged that if he had taken a case to go to London and the state was not agreeing with the apartheid government, and Brown Fisher said, "Ek is Afrikaner."